you don't have to empty a tank this week. You can drop it. There's two reasons. One is protecting water, and if you hold off for a little bit, you'll get better utilization of your slurry and you get better bang for your buck. You're going to save money if you can push it out another little bit. So lower your tanks a little bit. Don't have to be blasted completely out. And then the other thing for slurry, any nutrient, it's the right time, the right place, the right product, the right rate. Those rules apply to slurry the very same as they apply to bag 18612. It's the very same, just in a different form of fertilizer.
Closed period for spreading of organic manure ended recently for zones A and B and will end in a fortnight's time for zone C. However, just because you can spread doesn't mean you should. And it's for that reason that I've asked Cathal Somers, Teagasc Water Quality Specialist, to join me today to discuss the conditions people need to take into account when planning to spread organic fertilisers at this time of year. Conditions are good in many places at present. There's varying levels of growth across the country, but there is a threat of a storm towards the weekend and maybe colder conditions returning, which could change the whole scenario. So I started by asking Cathal how he'd answer the question about whether to spread or not this week.
I feel sorry for farmers. It's easy for you and I to sit here and come up with these suggestions, and I'm going to lay it out the way I think it should be. And I know it's not easy for farmers, but look, I'll just say it the way it is. I suppose there's two things that I'd like to let. I always say to farmers is we have calendar farming, right? So and you've said we're allowed out in zones, and they are spreading down your way at the moment, and they're spreading up outside my door at the moment as well. It's going on, and that's fine. But I suppose what I want to identify is that there's two things. Calendar farming is a guideline. That's just a guideline. So you have to draw a line in the sand somewhere to give farmers indication of when you can spread and when you can't spread. But it's not best practice, I suppose. So that's what we're going to discuss today. You use the guideline of when you're allowed out, and then you decide on what the conditions are and if they're suitable for me to go out with a slurry tanker. Now that's in a perfect world, a farmer would have all his facilities in place or her facilities in place, lovely loads of slurry storage. So that down in zone A, say for example, where you have 16 weeks storage, that you have those 4 months of storage that allows you to make a decision on when you want to go out with your slurry. So if we had 4 months in the year that's gone by, we had a lovely back end last year. So on paper, all the farmers in zone A should have, be well able to get into February without spreading slurry if they want. But we know that sometimes water gets into tanks and things go wrong and the tanks fill, so they have to get out, right? So that's one farmer. If the tanks are full now and you have to go out, the date is right. The weather conditions actually are okay at the moment. Soil temperatures are actually up around 6 or 7. They're climbing. It hasn't rained for a week down here. I know there is potentially a bit of rain coming into the weekend. There's uncertainties around storm, but the regulations say that if it's not going to rain heavy within 48 hours, you're good to go. Soil temperatures are good. You're good to go. If ground conditions are good as well, so if you're not damaging ground, if it's not saturated, you're good to go. If it's not snow or frozen, you're good to spread. So, like on paper at the moment, we are good to go, right? You can spread as long as that storm is not coming in. You want to keep an eye on that. So that's telling you a farmer that's going out there at the moment spreading. Okay, and look, that's advice we've given ourselves over the years. So what I'm saying now is for a farmer, and I'd say it loud and clear, I always think a slurry tank is like a bank account. It's a vault full of liquid money to me, in my eyes. That's the way I see it. I think 1,000 gallons worth, what, €26 or something at the moment.
26, yeah.
Yeah, it's a lot of money. So I'm going to turn this a little bit on its head. So I'm here, I'm a water quality specialist. I want to protect water, and I'm sure a lot of the listeners here are interested in protecting water for various reasons, because they like clean water, because they want to protect irrigation, whatever. So it's all in our interest to do everything in our power to keep the water clean. So, and on the other side of the coin, then our farmers need to make money and we need to save money. And so in order to do that, we can use our slurry more efficiently. We can pull back on NP and K, which is brilliant. So at the moment, growth rates are okay. I don't know. I was looking at growth rates before I came on to you. They're anything from 2.5 up to 12 and 13 in some parts of the country, but it's mostly around 2, 3, 4, something like that. So if you go out this week with 2,000 gallons of slurry, you're talking what, 9 units of nitrogen, maybe 10 or sorry, 8. If you had 2,000 gallons, you're going out with about 18 units
18
of
or
nitrogen,
19 units,
about
yeah.
10 units of phosphorus, and about, I don't know, 64 units of potassium. So if you do the figures on the growth rates, and you're probably better than me on it, and how much the grass will utilize now to take up that amount of nitrogen in particular putting out, because we know phosphorus will bind pretty well. It's going to take until March, to utilize that into the grass with the growth rates that are going to be predicted until March, because we know over, if you look at the 5-year average of grass growth, grass doesn't properly kick off when we get into the 1st of March, depending on weather, obviously. The problem that farmers have, and I know this loud and clear because I talked to plenty of them, is that calving season's coming, and they want to get the slurry out now so that they can have clear on a calving. That's one thing for dairy farmers. Another thing is that, and we spoke about this before, and farmers would often say to me is, I'm afraid not to put it out now, even though I could wait till February if I wanted, but I want to put it out now in case it rains for the month of February and I get caught. So my answer to that is, if you put out slurry now in case it rains heavy in February, um, like, where is that slurry going to go in February? It's not going to be utilized. It's going to go into the river. So I know you're kind of in your head, you're saying we're solving the problem by getting it out in case it rains heavy in February, it might get caught. But if we do that, we're putting pressure on the rivers, and that's coming right back on top of our farmers, via regulation, derogation, and all the other stuff that goes with it. So I'm not really answering your question well, but I suppose what I'm trying to say is, if you have tank space, hold off for another while. I suppose the sweet spot for me, if the weather plays ball with us, is probably the 2nd week of February. Is where I think the sweet spot is, and I know weather doesn't always play ball with us, but that's what I'm looking at. But currently, at the moment, I suppose, going back to your question, if you are in a position where tanks are getting full, when and they need to spread, that's fair enough. They have to be done. You can get out this week. So what I would say to you is, you don't have to empty a tank this week. It doesn't have to be emptied. You can drop it. There's 2 reasons. One is protecting water, and the other one is going back to what I said. If you hold off for a little bit, you'll get better utilization of your slurry, and you get better bang for your buck. You're going to save money if you can push out another little bit. So lower your tanks a little bit. Don't have to be blasted completely out. And then the other thing is going back to where you target. We always kind of look at for slurry, any nutrient, it's the right time, the right place, the right product, the right rate. So that those rules apply to slurry the very same as they apply to bag 18612. It's the very same, just in a different form of fertilizer. So I would always say to farmers going out now, and the farmers laugh now when they hear this, because it's simple, like, go to the driest field. Like, obviously go to the driest field, because we don't want to be going to wet fields. If you're tracking, you shouldn't be in it. But just to caveat that, it's not just at your driest field. You're looking for making bang for your buck and stopping losing nutrients. You're looking for grass, a grass that will grow. Those fields are highly productive fields that will utilize that slurry, because the key to solving the slurry problem is, if you put it out in the field, if we can get the grass to take it up as effectively and as quick as possible, then we're away on the pig's back. So that's the key. So those fields that maybe, I would always target silage ground. It's the most expensive grass you're going to grow. So target those first. It's hungry for P and K and N. So target those. That'll save you money. And then after that, then your low indexes, your P's and K's. But if you're targeting low P's and K's, I'd be looking for that ground that has decent pH, because you want that utilized, especially this time of year. If you're on the lower pH ground, obviously correct the pH, but the lower pH ones, if you're putting nutrient out this time of year, it doesn't utilize it as well, because the growth is not as good. So that's kind of the rules that I align myself with when I spread an area slurry. And I'm not sure. I think a lot of that goes on anyway, but my main concern is, when I drive around, and even you look around the fields around here, is, when slurry goes out, particularly if it's with a contractor maybe, I'd be looking for slurry to be spread 1,500 to 2,000 gallons maximum this time of year, because the growth is low. Like, when we get into the season, when you get into April, May, June, we can spread it a little bit heavier. But now, at the moment, you'd want to be sticking to 15 to 200, 2,000. But unfortunately, if you go looking around, you'll probably see 3, 4, and 5,000 gallons a acre spread on certain fields, and that's not good for water quality, and it's not actually good for grass production either, because it's a lot of ammonia to dump on a field at one time, and it kind of kicks the bacteria in the head, and stuns them a little bit. And we're relying on those bacteria and those earthworms and all that stuff to break that down first and utilize it to give it to the plant as well. So
Very, very good, Cathal. So, like, the rate piece is probably one thing, which is very important, and I do agree with you that there is a tendency for people to come in maybe, and it's easier to put out 4,000 gallons on 20 acres than 2,000 gallons on 40 acres. So, people have to be, I suppose, push the agenda. They are the paymasters effectively. I suppose I don't like using that term, but like at the same
Yeah.
time, they're doing a service for you. They should do the service the way you want it done. And then I suppose the other piece of it is then like is there a tendency to spread a lot of that slurry that we're talking about now very close to the yard rather than actually transporting it to the silage ground? And how much of an influence is that even? And then the other question that I always ask about it, because I think we're poor on them in general. We talk about them a lot, but in practice, it doesn't happen as much as it should. The buffer zones, how important are the buffers?
You're after hitting on three really important things, and I'm glad you brought them up. The yard, yeah, the yard is obviously hit the most because it's handy. We're under a bit of pressure. We're trying to get stuff done quickly. Contract comes in, the yard gets hit. But anytime that you pull up, and I didn't even mention soil sampling at the moment, and I think we've talked a lot over the years about soil sampling. You don't know what you're spreading. You don't know what to spread unless you know what your soils are like. So that's really important. But going back to the yard, generally, if I go to any farm, particularly heavy stock farms, and I look at there's fertility, and you've just nailed it there. The all around the farm yard is generally decent for fertility because it's the closest access to tanks. But we have to come away from that and try and target those areas that need it. And it goes back to my very first point. Slurry is a very valuable nutrient. It's as valuable as a bag of 18612 or 101020, whatever it may be. And we have to see it as that, not a waste product. If you keep dumping it on around the farmyard and you have index fours all over the place, you're not doing any good for water. You're not doing any good for your own pocket. So use your fertility, get your NMP plan out, study it. Don't have it stuck in a drawer and not use it, and target those fields. It's really important for a farmer. The second thing you just brought to my mind there is when you do go out to areas on the farm and you're wondering like if they're safe or not to spread on. Obviously, if they're farmers will know whether fields are dry or not. But there's another, I suppose, tool that we're asking farmers to use, these pollution impact potential maps. Some farmers will have heard of them and some not. If you haven't, ask your advisor, especially if you're in with your derogation getting done this year, the advisors will show them to you. And what the pollution impact potential maps do is to identify areas on your farm that are kind of modeled that we reckon will probably have more heavier soils. You can identify the heavier soils in land where you'd be more problematic as regards getting overland flow, when it rains heavy, that it could actually physically wash that slurry down into a river or into a drain. It also shows flow paths when it rains, where that water goes. So you can actually target your slurry around those areas to not get caught out, I suppose, because what we don't want as farmers, and the farmers do not want this either, because no farmer wants slurry going into water. They want it going into the grass. It can kind of help farmers decide, and I know farmers know their own land, but it can kind of help them look at locations that have potential, to be washed across the land. And the last thing then, I suppose the buffer zone that you mentioned, I always see the buffer zone. Anyone likes a bit of football or hurling, it's like a full back line to me. It's the last line of defence. Um, if and it's like this: if you're in a full back line and a ball is someone's coming in taking a shot, and you're going to be given out about the midfielders and the full forward line, the whole lot. The job has not been done out the field. So the buffer line is the last line of defence. If you have a decent buffer zone, so we know the rules at the moment for zone A and zone B, which are open at the moment. Buffer zones have to be 10 meters for the first 2 weeks of the open season. Same for zone C when it opens up, and after that it becomes 5. But if you have slopes going down to drains or rivers, that buffer zone should remain at 10 all year round. So that's really important. So that's the buffer zone, the distance between the spread pattern and the river, the top of the bank. Vitally important because if you do get a bit of wash off, like you suggested, if the rain did come in, it has a little bit of area to be protected. Now, beyond that, if you can go a step further, and a lot of farmers are doing it, if you have your fence up 1.5 meters or 2 meters on top of the bank, which a lot of the heavier stock farmers have to have anyway, a 1.5 meters, if you can have decent bit of riparian margin, what I mean is just grow to there, grass, hedge, anything like that between the river and that field and that buffer zone. Now you have two areas of protection there, and they're excellent. They might look like a small thing, but they're excellent. And I'm glad you mentioned the buffer zones, because one thing I always do with farmers is I get a couple of GA polls at every discussion group, and I give them the polls and ask them to mark out the buffer zones. And they're very mixed. Some people know about them, some don't. So it's a really good just to know where your buffer zone is. And the last thing on buffer zones, I suppose, not to leave you too long, is if you are near water abstraction points. So say if there's a school near you or a housing estate or a big housing estate, there's different buffer zones for those water abstraction areas. It goes from 25 meters to 200. if you're in one of those areas, it's likely you will have been contacted by Department of Agriculture, but just be careful not to be caught out in them and treat a drain the very same as the river because drains are heavily connected to rivers. So if you get a wash of slurry in there, it'll hit the river eventually.
So, Carl, basically, lots of people will be familiar with the blue lines on the irrigation maps and so forth in the last couple of years, but you're saying ignore them to a certain extent and just assume every drain is a blue line effectively, isn't that?
Yeah, we could go by the blue line rule, and I know for fencing it's the very same thing. You have to fence your blue
Mm.
lines, but like if you go out with your OSI map and you have the blue lines and then the broken lines, so the blue line signifies a river and the broken line signifies an open drain. But sometimes when you go onto a farm, that open drain looks the very same as the river, and sometimes what's meant to be the river looks like a drain. And technically, on paper, yes, you're only meant to treat the solid blue lines as rivers and comply with the regulations for buffer zones and your fencing. But what I do say to farmers is it makes no difference at the end of the day. It's if the water quality doesn't improve, and we know it's not going where we're meant to be, particularly for your irrigation farmers listening, treat everything like a river. Every drain, every drained farm, because it doesn't matter. You can't go to the EU Commission in a couple of years' time to say, "Oh, geez, I use my buffer zones on the solid blue lines," because that doesn't matter. They don't care. They're just looking at the water quality in the river. So what I'm saying to farmers is, I'm asking you to go a little bit beyond regulation. And treat everything like a river because in the end of the day we're only going to shoot ourselves in the foot, and I know some people might think that's a little bit unfair, but I'm coming from a place where I'm trying to help protect our industry because it's only going to fall back on us farmers and it's only going to hit us with other regulation or make things more awkward as down the line. So, and that costs money.
And I suppose there's another side to too, Kyle. I mean, if you treat every one of them the same, there's no ambiguity then.
Yeah,
Is this one that I'm supposed to be keeping out 10 meters from, or if you do them all the same, it's fine. I suppose you maybe kind of addressed it earlier, but just the last question I probably put to you again is, like you said about the storm potentially coming in. I think they were even suggesting on Met Éireann last night that there could be a cold spell coming again.
yeah,
How significant is that now in terms of the stuff that is being applied? And I yeah, like I exactly like you. I've seen both sides of it from farmers' perspectives in terms of they held in the last couple of years, maybe during January, and then got caught with the wetter weather later.
yeah,
And I find it hard to rationalize this in my head, like because if we do the right rate, we do the right field, we adhere to the buffer zones, and we spread it in better conditions in January, is it safer? And like this is probably the this is why I wanted to talk to you because I like we need to get the answers to this to so that people are clear on why the rules are the way they are and so forth.
yeah,
So I suppose good conditions. I think it was 9 degrees in the car coming in there this morning. Soil temperatures. We've one guy puts soil temperature into a WhatsApp group every Monday, and like it was down at 2 degrees during the snow, and it was back up again. It there was like a 6 7 degree shift basically in a week. Last week he hasn't had sent in yet this week. But like if our soil temperatures are sitting north of 6 at the moment, but there's a cold spell coming. Do you not
yeah.
spread? Do you spread? Like, do you know?
See, it's in the regs, the gap regs, that soil temperatures are above, say, 5.6 degrees and rising. So if we know that there's going to be a cold snap coming, that's going to fall back below again. Technically, we shouldn't really spread. But my caveat there is like if you have a tank that's bulging at the moment, and you don't have a choice. You kind of have to do something with it, or it's going to overflow down the tank and it's going to get into the river anyway. So
Yeah,
at the moment, like if you're caught in that position, now like the short-term weather at the moment is not giving us that the soil temperature is going to fall below six
yeah,
degrees. This storm that's coming in from the US, that polar front coming in, it's not predicted at the moment, so we're not really fully sure what's coming in. But currently conditions are okay. But if you're in the position to hold off for a while, I would. And there's two reasons actually. Well, the main reason is if we go back to the science behind why we shouldn't, why it's worse to spread right now, is over the winter period, that kind of up till January, it's the highest losses of NMP, and that's the ACP program has shown that time in time out, and they published that work. The reason being is because once it gets into winter, we get more rain, obviously. But the other side of that is we have a lot less evapotranspiration. So in the summertime, we're protected by the sun and the heat, so it actually evaporates off a lot of the water. So it takes the water away rather than it all seeping downwards, and that protects us. But we don't have that at the moment. It's very little at the minute. It'll grow as the year gets by. So even when we get into February, March, that'll get better and better as light comes on. So that will help us there. The other problem is our water table is quite high at the moment as well because it charged over the winter, so it's quite high. So between the soil level, the saturation levels that we've had over the last while with the snow and the rain and all that, I know we've had a week of dry weather, but a lot of soil is quite wet there still. So the leeway is very, very narrow at the minute. So if we could wait another little while for things to dry up more light, more growth, it's just much safer. So what it's all about in the end of the day is the more growth we have, the safer we are. And currently growth is okay, but it's still very, very low. If you break the figures down, to get rid of that 2,000 gallons, it's going to take a while. And if that cold snap did happen to come in again, it's going to slow down the process all over again.
Yeah, okay. So basically what you're saying is the sponge is soaking at the moment and putting
Yeah.
more water on the sponge it's not going to soak it like.
Yeah.
Yeah, okay.
Look, I know that's probably what people don't want to hear, but if you're in the position you can hold off, hold off. If you're not in that position, the conditions are okay at the minute. Yeah, currently.
Okay, so just following through on the hold off position then, just to finish it up then, Cathal, like you said, super back end last year, thankfully, it's been the saving of the country effectively, I would say. But it's probably opened people's eyes as well, maybe in terms of the storage capacities that they do have. And I think to be fair to the majority of people, lots and lots of people, not everybody obviously, but lots and lots of people have what they're supposed to have on paper. And you did touch on it already. Uh, but in practice, they're finding it challenging. So, like, I think there's a possibility, I could be wrong on this, but there's a good chance that there's a TAM is going to be announced the end of the week, potentially. From what we're hearing, there's going to be scope to put in applications from the end of this week again. So we'd be anticipating that there's something coming there. Maybe people do need to address that, and they need and I suppose that drives people mad because there's big money now. We're talking about 90,000 of a ceiling and so forth, and you won't get any sort of a tank now for less than 30,000
Mm.
basically. But what from your experience in the asset role that you're in, what do you see are the main challenges that people have that could actually potentially avoid them having to do that? And
Yeah.
like things that small things, small money maybe cost nothing in the overall scheme of things to avoid finding that pressure point at come the 13th or the 14th of January or the 16th or 17th of January, whatever, depending on the zone. Or it's true up in Cavan Monaghan and so forth as well, that come the 1st or 2nd of February, it's not, even though you're saying that that's a good time to, or a better time to start to go because things are, daylight is increasing and so forth. They still have soil moisture challenges, probably more so than some other parts of the country. So what are the things that people can do maybe before we ever consider applying for a grant? I mean, because if we can apply for the grant, but we could fill those tanks just as easily too.
Just to differentiate between the wetter part of the country and the drier part of the country, I suppose, because anyone that's listening from the wetter parts now will be shouting at the podcast there at the moment. But I'm down here in Wexford, right, with very dry land. Okay, so I sometimes forget like that the rest of the country is not like here. But like the difference in the mindset between farmers down, and I'm sure where you are as well, because you're dry enough, where we are, and the mindset out of farmers in the wetter part of the country is the farmers up further up the country, they have accepted that they're not going to get out until March, April, and they have accepted that, and they've set their systems up for that. Whereas we're different. Well, because our land, like you could go out here Christmas Day and graze this year, no problem if you wanted. Because our land is set up for that, and we can get out with animals quicker. It's in our heads that, geez, we're not as we're not in as a bad a position, so we don't have to have those tanks until March, April. So that's number one. So it's a psychological thing a little bit as well. But I suppose to go back to your question, the cheaper option now, protecting slurry tanks is really difficult. I say the very first thing, and you mentioned on paper, a lot of farmers are good, and there's a lot of concrete that's been laid in the last couple of years, a lot of money spent. People are people are going after this, trying to fix the problem because nobody wants to be in the position on the first week of January worrying about slurry tank filling, right? That's the one thing I'll say. But what I will say is I give up looking at measurements on farm yards about if animals versus slurry tank size. I give up doing that. I normally just say to a farmer, when do you have to go out on a general normal year without anything going mad? When do you have to get out? And that kind of tells me how under pressure or how not they are. So I've come to the conclusion that I think if you have to have a certain amount of slurry storage, you probably need 30 to 40% additional on top of that as a buffer if for years that go wrong. And I know people won't want to hear that, but what I always say to farmers, once you have the ground open to build tanks, build a lot more than you want. It's a lot cheaper to do that when the ground is open than to add a piece on. So unfortunately, I think farmers are going to have 35% of a buffer, 30% at least, anyway, to allow for these mad years. And they're happening more often, unfortunately. Going back to your original question, how is there cheap solutions to it? What we're finding, um, particularly for yards that are not greenfield sites that have built add-on over the years, we see a lot of farms now that were, milking 40, 50 cows. They're up on 200 cows now or more, even whatever. So farms are built on, and sometimes farmyards are not well laid out, and there's water flowing across yards that shouldn't be flowing across yards in from fields and getting down into tanks. Um, Even for example, big silage pits. That you have water getting into them and the valve is open going into the tank and they're filling the tank. There's a lot of that kind of stuff, clean rainwater getting into our slurry tanks, filling them up. And you'd often hear a lot of farmers are talking about dilute slurry. The reason there's a lot of dilute slurry is because there's water getting into them that shouldn't be getting in. So there's a lot of work that could be done on that. Unfortunately, it's tricky to solve. What it takes is going out on a really wet day, and seeing where water's flowing and try and block water coming in from fields, looking at where water's traveling across your yard, looking at big, I suppose, areas where cattle have even crushes or, even where the cows are coming in to be milked, where they're standing, like where you have those collecting areas that are meant to be collecting tanks, is trying to minimize that as much as possible. And I remember several farmers said to me, would we better kind of putting a roof on the yard? And you would if you could, but like it's really expensive and it's not something that's going to happen to many yards, but some farmers have done it. But that's really what you're looking at, trying to minimize the amount of clean water getting into those slurry tanks. And really you're looking at those areas, those animal collection areas and silage pits, and trying to build them better. Say, for example, I'll give you one on silage pit, right? I saw one silage pit. It must be nearly 3/4 an acre big. It's massive, right? And there was effluent channels at the bottom, and that was it. And I was kind of saying to the farmer, if I was doing that again, I'd be segregating the front of that pit to channelize it so you can shut off different areas of it. And these are the kind of things we need to think about.
Yeah, definitely. So I suppose would it be worth, just as you're talking there now, the thought struck me, would it be worth people actually testing the slurry, not from the point of, yes, from the point of view, obviously, of what they have to spread, but actually identifying maybe where water is getting into tanks. Maybe they might, people mightn't always be conscious of where that you mightn't even see where the water is getting into tanks in some cases, because it can be kind of maybe seeping in under a slat or something like that out of sight. So would it be worth just testing tanks for one? Obviously, there's the positive of getting the information that slurry is better quality slurry than that slurry, and we want to target that to there. And I'm sure the lads will be talking about that in their webinars in the grass tent this week as well and stuff. So. But would that maybe be one way of people figuring out that they might have a problem in a way?
Yeah, look, you could, and you raise a good thing. Like, I think most farmers should be analyze the slurry because it's a cheap test and you get a lot from it, and it doesn't cost much to do. On the identifying if it's watery, I think a lot of farmers will tell you they'll know if it's watery or not, and they'll say to you, they'll all say to you, that tank is always filling on me, and they'll know if it's a heavy night rain or something or weekend, they'll know it's filling on them. So I think a lot of farmers know the tanks that they have problems with. Um, but on the analysis side, I 100% would agree with you. Just from a financial point of view, and targeting the right amount of nutrients to the right place, I think it's a great idea to do it, and it's not expensive. But most farmers will know which tanks are filling. Well, one thing I forgot to say to you actually, and you brought up about the umbilical system actually. When you mentioned kind of dilute slurry to me, water slurry, I know going into umbilical systems, people like more dilute slurries, easier, you don't get blockages. But just if you have contractors coming in, just be careful that the umbilical system, some might not have a flow meter on it, that just make sure that's not spreading 6,000 gallons versus 1,500 to the farmer's going to suffer, not the person in the tractor. So just keep an eye on that. The systems are brilliant, but just because a tanker can't travel on land doesn't mean a tractor and umbilical can travel on it. So just be careful there. That's one thing just brought to mind when you asked that question.
Okay, so Carl, look, you've done exactly what I wanted you to do for me today in terms of just giving people tips and pointers as to what they should and shouldn't do. And I suppose we're very conscious of the fact that, like we said there, people maybe need to invest in storage potentially, but they don't have it today, so they have to deal with those problems, and you get very good advice around that. So thanks for coming on today, and I'm sure we'll talk again at some stage during the year.
Thanks, Stuart.
That's all for this week's episode of the Dairy Edge podcast, and my thanks to Cathal Somers for joining me on this week's show. Don't forget to rate, review and subscribe to the podcast. You can listen on Apple and Google Podcasts as well as Spotify, and for more information go to the Teagasc website at teagasc.ie. And just to remind people that we also have a dedicated email address for the Dairy Edge now if people want to contact us, and thanks to those who have. You can get us at dairyedge.podcast@teagasc.ie. That's dairyedge.podcast@teagasc.ie. I'm Stuart Childs, and join us next time for your Dairy Edge.